Welcome to Quid Pros Quo. Hi, I'm Rin.
And I'm Zac.
And today we are talking about the three-act structure, also known as Freytag's Pyramid. This is part of our series on story structure, which we did an intro episode to 2 weeks ago, and the Hero's Journey episode 1 week ago. So if you haven't heard those yet, go back and listen to them. We'll link them in the show notes. Here we go.
Yeah, so Freytag's Pyramid, or the three-act structure, is a really basic structure that you're probably familiar with from language arts in school. You may have seen it as like an upside-down check mark, or a witch's hat is another kind of image that is often used in order to describe this structure. And it's divided up into acts. Acts as in like I am acting on behalf of somebody else. These acts are not necessarily the same thing as the kind of acts that you see inside of plays, but rather they are kind of narrative units that you use to chunk up your story to be able to talk about the sorts of beats that happen in certain sections of your story, which help you to make sure that the structure is good.
Yeah.
So you said that there are three acts. We're just going to go through each of them. Rin, what would you add to our description of Freytag's Pyramid?
I went to one panel at a writing conference a couple years ago, and it was like talking about how Freytag's Pyramid mirrors the biofeedback stress triangle, and they talked about how good storytelling can take you through not the stress triangle, the biofeedback triangle reaction response thing. I can't remember exactly what it's called.
Yeah.
But that's also something to consider, and we won't really go into that. If you want an episode on that, let us know, and I'll dig up my notes from that session. But if you have a basic understanding of biofeedback and you want to compare it to this as you listen to this, that would be neat. It's a cool thing to think about. Okay, let's dive right into the first act. So, Act 1 is setting the stage, and it starts with the inciting incident. We've already talked about the hero's journey. Act 1 is all taking place in the known world, and will end about where the heroes cross the threshold, which I can't remember if Zac said this already, but the acts are often not equal lengths.
Oh, that's a good point.
Act 2 is usually much longer than Acts 1 and 3.
Absolutely. The bulk of the story is going to take place during Act 2. And depending on your genre, Act 1 may be so small as to be non-existent. If you're starting in media res, you're not going to have an Act 1 because the inciting incident is going to be the thing that happens on the first page.
Yeah. And then the inciting incident, which ends Act 1, will set up the central question of the story, and this is obviously going to depend on your story what the central question is. I would say, I'm trying to think of books, and now I've forgotten every book I've ever read. You know when you try and do something on the spot? Should have prepped the notes for this. But the central question of Dune is, who is Paul Atreides on Arrakis, and who is he going to be?
Yep. Yeah. So this often has to do with if characters are going to get what they want, if they're going to achieve their goals. Like Rin was talking about, who are they going to become? How are things going to change? Those are all the kinds of questions that are asked as part of the central question. One way that you can think about the central question is as a way of exploring your theme, because an easy way of thinking about the theme is the because that comes after the yes or no to the answer to the central question. So does Anakin fall to the dark side in Revenge of the Sith? Yes, because he is afraid of losing his wife. That helps to frame the theme of the story, and you can use the same inside of your stories. And I think that's one of the strengths of this. One of the strengths of this structure is that the central question is a really helpful tool for helping you to think about your theme and where it goes inside of your story.
Yeah, that's a really good point, especially because sometimes themes can be so hard to pin down. But and we'll talk about this in a couple episodes, but in Save the Cat, they have like a theme stated beat. And like often when I'm doing my first draft, I don't know what the theme is of my book. But
Mm-hmm,
when you're
mm-hmm,
doing the 3 act structure, it's kind of built into there for you.
mm-hmm.
So I feel like that is definitely a pro of it. And of course, we'll go over the pros and cons of each structure at the end of each episode. But like I was saying, Act 2 is the majority of the story. We're moving on to Act 2, where the tension builds and explodes into the climactic moment. Which is most of the rest of the hero's journey. Like all of the unknown world. Like you've seen the circle diagrams where like 10% of the circle is like an iceberg, 10% is above the line in the known world, and 90% of it is below.
Yeah, exactly. So when you're thinking about the central question, this is being developed over the course of the second act. And when we say developed, we're saying that you as the author are asking and answering sub-questions. And the answers to those sub-questions ultimately contribute to how the central question is going to be answered. So if we're talking about a murder mystery where the central question is, will the murderer be caught? The sub questions are going to be like, will the detective convince so and so to tell their secret? Will the detective recognize or find evidence at the crime scene? Those are the sorts of sub questions that are being asked and answered as you go on.
Yeah. I think the important thing is sub questions can be both like a catalyst and a reaction to things that happen in the story.
Mm-hmm.
Like the question is the detective going to be able to get someone to tell the secret? That's like a catalyst in the story. Whereas if the detective gets kidnapped during their attempts to solve the mystery, a sub question may be like, will they be able to escape with their lives if it's like a murder mystery?
Yeah, very good point. We talked about how the second act ends in the climactic moment. This is called the climax, and the climax is the height of the tension, and it's where the question is resolved. Now, one of the things to be aware of when you're using the 3 act structure is that if you're messing with scale, like the size of what's going on inside of the story, and you're increasing the scale as time goes on, it's really important that the scale is at its biggest at the climax. Because if the scale is biggest before or after the climax, you're going to have a weird pacing thing. So as an example, in the Last Jedi film, the height of the scale is when they're on Snoke's ship, when, it's the epic space battle kind of thing. That's the biggest scale that the story is. But then the answer to the central question is resolved after that on during the Battle of Crate. And that's part of the reason why the film feels so long, is because the central question is answered after the height of the drama or the height of the scale.
That makes sense. As always, The Last Jedi coming in clutch for a bad example. Do you realize how often we quote that movie on this show as a bad example? I swear it's like our first bad example every time. That's so funny.
Well, I can talk about another Star Wars example, which also has this problem, but manages to pull it off pretty well. And it has to do with the 4 act structure, which we'll talk about next week. So maybe I'll hold on to it until then.
Perfect. Act 3 is the winding down of the story as we move into Act 3 and loose threads are tied up and the story ends. This is often also called the denouement, which is a French word meaning the end or the closing. And it's the return flight in the hero's journey. And you talked about the climax being where the central question is answered, but then your note here also says it's answered in the denouement.
Yeah, it becomes clear. Basically, the climax is the decision point, but then you're working out the consequences during the denouement. So if the murder mystery is, will the detective figure out who the murderer is? During the climax, the murderer is is revealed during the denouement, the consequences of the character of the murderer being revealed are worked out, where it's like yes, and then whatever follows inside of Act 3.
Perfect. And this whole time we've been calling it the 3-act structure, and at the beginning we mentioned Freytag's pyramid, and I just wanted to clarify that real quick. Freytag's pyramid is the technical term. Did we already clarify this? I can't remember.
No, we just talked about how they're synonyms.
Okay. Then maybe this was unnecessary. I was just like looking at it, and then like the Freytag's pyramid was like at the bottom of the notes, and I was like, wait.
Oh, that was
Did
my
we ever
bad.
talk about this?
That was my bad about where I decided to write everything.
That's okay. I was like, have we even said the word Freytag's triangle this entire time? Let's go back. We were just talking about how we answer the central question. In a standalone novel, most of the sub-questions will be answered here in the denouement. But if you're doing a series, or if you want the question to be ambiguous, you won't answer it, because if you're setting up a series, you need a hook for the next book. Like, yeah. You've got to have something. We're coming up on time, so we're going to do a quick pros and cons list. A pro of this plot structure is I think it's very easily understood, because this is what we teach like elementary and middle schoolers. So it's simple enough even for children to understand it, which is not a failing on its part. I think simplicity is always a boon. And it's versatile. You can use it in a lot of different genres.
Some of the cons with the 3-act structure of Freytag's pyramid is that sometimes it can be hard to sustain in long form. And part of the reason for that is because the structure doesn't give you a lot of hints as to how you're supposed to do the middle. So you kind of easily fall into the, oh my gosh, the middle is dragging and I really want to just be done with it, because you don't have a framework for what is actually supposed to happen during this really long Act 2. So that's one potential drawback. Freytag's pyramid, the 3-act structure, doesn't explicitly talk about subplots or multiple plot threads like some other structures do. There are ways for you to get around that, but it's something to be aware of when you are tackling this story structure. Yeah, absolutely.
We will talk more about dragging middles when we talk about Save the Cat. But in next week's episode, when we do the 4-act structure, I feel like it's not as much of an issue there, because you have what are known as pinch points and plot points to help frame it. So if you haven't heard of the 4-act structure or the 7-point structures, is technically the same thing, listen in next week. This has been Quid Pros Quo. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next week.
Quid Pros Quo is hosted by DC Winters and ZK Jensen. If you like this episode, be sure to leave us a rating. And if you'd like to contact us, you can email us at quidprosquo@gmail.com. For more episodes, check us out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever else you get your podcasts.